You are listening to Mollie on a Trip, music around Paris on Paris Underground Radio.
Salut! You have reached Mollie on a Trip, music around Paris. My name is Mollie, and I'm a former music executive, and I moved to Paris in 2022 for an adult gap year, kind of a post-COVID YOLO vibe. In the podcast, I'll be talking to musicians, songwriters, producers, and executives, both traveling and natives, about what they like to do here. I was interested in where they like to play shows, where they hang out, what kind of art they like to check out, where their favorite neighborhoods are, and my personal favorite is finding out where they like to eat and drink. Hope you enjoy. Grace Lee is a music executive living in Paris now. She is a utter badass and very interesting and also a friend. But I wanted to get her perspective on why she moved to Paris as a Korean American living in New York City, working at such successful big companies as YouTube and Columbia Records in New York in the heydays and having really fantastic jobs there. What brought her here and what she loves about here. And then some of her both secrets of advancing in the music industry all the way to what are her secrets about the things that she likes to eat and drink and do here in Paris. So please enjoy Grace Lee. Hello, Grace Lee. Hello, how are you? Good morning.
Mollie, how are you? Good morning.
So I wanted to start just like Twitter version. What is your history and where are you from?
Okay, so I am Korean American. Family lives in Korea. I was born in Seoul. I spent my childhood moving around a little bit or a lot. And eventually post high school and college, I landed in New York where I was for 20 years before I moved to Paris in February.
And in New York, you were in music, right? What was the sort of genesis of the career path there?
It's funny because when I think back and I think about like, how is it that I, who was someone who had no connection to the music industry, didn't really know what it was, had immigrant parents who were definitely nudging me toward the lawyer, doctor, engineer kind of thing. Like, how did I end up in music? And, I didn't study music. I wasn't one of those people who worked at the college radio station, or I didn't really even have knowledge of that. So I kind of came in quote unquote later. Like, I didn't know what the music industry was until after I graduated. But when I kind of think back on how I consumed music or how I enjoyed music as a child, I have like very distinct memories, right? And so like this is going to age me a little bit, but I'll say it anyway. So like when I was little, we grew up going to church every Sunday, and I on Sunday mornings would listen to Casey Kasem's Top 40, and it was like very important. I was a pop girl from the start, and the issue was I always would miss the 10 to 1 because that was the time when we had to leave to go to church. So I remember every week I would have a tape and I would record the radio so I could hear what, the 10 to 1 songs were. So when I think about that and like how into pop music I was, and I was like into all the award shows. Of course, my mom was super strict and didn't let me watch TV a lot, but I would like record the AMAs and record the Grammys so I could see what was going on. It like kind of makes sense that I went into music. But long story short, after graduation, I went to DC to work at a law firm. I thought I was going to be a lawyer. Misguided.
Wow, yeah.
I know, different life. And then I spent a year in DC, moved to New York, and just like started pounding the pavement. Because like I said, I didn't have any real knowledge of the music industry, how it worked, any connections, anything like that. So I was just like interviewing. And I finally got a gig.
Was the first one at a record label? Like where did it start?
No, so I was actually at MTV first, and I was an ad sales assistant. So it's funny because a lot of us in New York in the music industry always say that we like have a stint at 1515 Broadway at MTV building. And so I was one of those people. So yeah, I was in ad sales for a year. And again, while I was at MTV, I was like hustling and networking and trying to find connections into the music team. And it was the woman who was running the music team at the time, Amy Doyle, the GOAT, who helped me get a job at a record label. So then that was Columbia Records. A long time ago, 2005 is when I started as an assistant.
So were you there during the TRL days, by the way?
Girl, I was like so in the TRL days.
Tell me.
So kind of later on. So my TRL experiences were like after kind of like the craziness of the Backstreet and Sync, Christina, Britney era. Cause like I started at Columbia in 2005, but you know, TRL was still a huge thing.
Huge.
And 106 in Park was a huge thing. And that was my job, was to bring artists to TRL, to 106 in Park, and have them premiere videos, get interviewed, perform. It was a major thing. And all the award shows too. So that's what I did at Columbia. So though I worked in the MTV building for a time, my like real interaction with TRL didn't happen until after I left MTV and went to the label.
And then you were at Columbia for quite a while, right? And you grew into pretty high level there. What was that experience like?
So when I started at Columbia, it was February 2005, and the business sort of hadn't yet, or maybe was just starting to figure out how digital worked. And it was digital downloads at the time, right? This was pre-streaming. So like we really have worked in this business, both of us, for so long that it's just like amazing how much change has happened.
Yeah, we've seen like the different dinosaur eras. There's like the Pleistocene, there's like the CD era. Yeah, it's really wild. Anyway.
Exactly. It's like so crazy. So yeah, when I started, it was still like physical sales was a thing. People were a little scared of iTunes. Like everyone had just been really, you know, Napster was a thing that really affected the industry, obviously. And so kind of the label and how it was when I started was entirely different from how it was when I left, right? Because again, it was sort of like a generational of like tech change that happened during that time. So when I first got to, it was Columbia Records, it was in 550 Madison, iconic building, Midtown, New York. And it's funny when I think about how it was. I was in the video promotion department. And at the time, we still had we had a video library at the label, and they were like beta tapes. Do you remember those? Like huge videotapes of music videos. And we had like every music video that was like ever done by a Columbia artist. And it was just so funny. So I actually forgot what your question was.
Oh, just like your experience there and sort of your genesis from like over those, it was 9 years, right? It was 9 years at Columbia?
9 years, 8 years and 10 months. So I started at Columbia as an assistant. And when I left, I was a VP. And I was promoted very quickly at Columbia. And I was lucky because I felt like I always had people who were like sort of looking out for me in a way. And I had always had good relationships with the heads of the label. And, you know, they're very encouraging and, you know, putting me in higher positions, maybe some of which I wasn't yet ready for, but still trusting me, right? So it was an interesting kind of ride. And I still say, you know, everything I know about the music business, I learned at Columbia Records, you know? So when I went in, I was, a young kind of like 25-year-old assistant, didn't know anything about the industry, how it worked, who the players were, how like teams interacted with each other, different players in an artist's world and how they work together. And I learned all of that at the label. So I'm very, very grateful for that time. And for the people that I met during that time. Obviously, I'm still friends with a lot of them. And I have a lot of relationships with the artists I worked with then, too.
Who were some of the artists that you worked with during that time that were like seminal and you were really connected to?
Okay, so it's so funny, right? Like when I was in high school, I really, really, really loved Oasis, like a lot.
Okay.
And I was living in Seoul, and I remember buying like the first two albums in Korea on CD. There was a Virgin Megastore in Seoul, and that's where I got them. So like years later at Columbia, we put out one Oasis album, and Noel Gallagher came to New York to do some promo. And so I took him around, and the label, we had like a party or something for him. And I was talking to one of my colleagues, and I was like, I just cannot believe this. Like, if 16-year-old me like knew where I would be right now on a boat on the Hudson River with Noel Gallagher, like, are you crazy? It was the coolest thing ever, right? but I remember it's that colleague, he told me, this is great. And like, it's awesome. And you get to meet heroes and stuff. He's like, but the real satisfying part is when you meet an artist early in their career and you help them become something, right? And you play a small part in building their career and their dream and helping them reach audience and community. And that is the most satisfying thing. And I remember he said that and I was like, oh, that's interesting. Because I guess to date, I hadn't yet felt that. So I would say like the coolest thing about Columbia was that I got to meet and work with a lot of artists that I loved and respected for so long, right? So like the Noel Gallagher thing for sure, Beyonce, Bruce Springsteen, Barbara Streisand, lots of bees. And then I worked with artists that like were there from the beginning, like Adele and like One Direction, John Legend, Haim, so many like great artists that I got to kind of, J. Cole, another one, amazing. From the beginning.
Love J. Cole.
Got to work with them. I know, he's the best. That was cool. What my coworker said at that point, like that rang true.
Do you still feel that way? Does that still resonate for you, that there's something about kind of development process that you love?
I think developing an artist is sort of like a lost art right now in the way that the business runs, the way that music is consumed, shorter attention spans, this and that. And it seems like a lot of people are chasing a TikTok hit, right? Like a lot of people in the business are chasing a TikTok hit, or numbers on TikTok kind of prove hit worthiness of a song or something. And I just so disagree with that. And I don't know if that makes me old school or what, but I think the process of building and developing an artist is still so important in terms of longevity of career. And, you can like one TikTok song. It's like, okay, this is not to demonize TikTok actually, because it can be such a great platform to like boost an artist, right? Or boost a song or build awareness to a song. And for that, I think it's great, but it doesn't build an artist, does it? And we've both worked in this for a long time, and it takes so much work and effort and time. No one wants to spend the time on developing an artist anymore. And so I think it is a little bit of a lost art, but it's still what I like to do. And I think I know, there are people left in this business that are still very interested in that and willing to invest time and money to build an artist's career. And yeah, that's what I like to do.
And then your last job before, and then obviously we'll get into La France, but then you went to YouTube.
The Paris of it all.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
The purpose of the podcast. And it's also just so interesting to hear all this. So Columbia, then you go to YouTube.
Yes. So I reached a point at Columbia where, again, I'd been there for almost 9 years and I really loved it and I learned so much, but I kind of started to feel a little itchy that maybe there was something else out there, maybe something outside of music. I thought I wanted to explore something else.
Back to law school?
Definitely not. But I was like, you know what? I think one of the, real realities about the music business is that your work and your personal life are very, very intertwined. And I think because of that, I felt like I needed some distance in order to actually figure out what I wanted to do next. And to me, the best way to do that was to take a break from work. So I left my job at Columbia at the end of 2013 without a job. And my intent was to just think and figure out what my next step was. And so I did that. It ended up being 8 months that I was on this sort of sabbatical. Not really. Gap year. We both use that term. Sort of a gap year. And during that time, I have to say, I didn't actually really figure out, there was no sort of clear sign being like, okay, this is what you should do. But what did happen was about 8 months into that, a friend of mine at YouTube who was working on the music team at YouTube said, listen, we have this project that we're working on. We need someone temporarily. I know you don't want a real job. Why don't you come for a couple months, join us? And it's artist relations kind of stuff. You can do it in your sleep. So I did. So I started at YouTube as a contractor and my contract kept getting renewed. And then finally one day they were like, you should just work here. Just work here. And so I was like, okay, dope. So that's how I started working at YouTube, kind of by accident. I know. And I ended up being there for another about 8.5 years. And that too was like such a learning experience and different lessons, right? So like, at Columbia, I learned all about the music industry and how it worked and, how everyone was intertwined and worked together and on all of the parts. And at YouTube, it was so interesting because it was so different. First of all, not a music company, right? And just the way they moved and thought and developed was just so different. I found it so interesting and I learned a lot in that job. But again, that after 8+ years, I felt like I needed a change. So I made a change.
If you're enjoying this episode of Music Around Paris, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Navigating the French, where Emily Monaco and experts teach us about the French through the study of the language. Mollie on a Trip, Music Around Paris will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Mollie on a Trip, Music Around Paris. I'm curious as to what are your first memories of knowing what Paris or France is? Did it come into your life when you were a child? Is it something you learned about? And then when did you start coming here?
First time I came to Paris, it was June 21st, 1996, Fete de la Musique. And I remember that because we got to Paris, it was like one of my best friend's birthday. She was turning 16 and we were here and we were like, what is this? What is Fete de la Musique? We had no idea, obviously. But that was like the first night we hung out in Paris. So like imagine,
Literally can't. That's wild.
Yeah. And we had such a great time. And it was a school trip that I came on that I first came to Paris. And since then, it sort of like has had a hold on me, has a hold on me that I could never quite shake it off Paris. In college, I studied abroad in London, so I came here several times. And then just over the years, I just found myself in Paris a lot. And then in COVID, sort of during the remote working days, YouTube was quite flexible and I spent a lot of time in Paris, which in retrospect was like a trial run, like several trial runs. Of course, I didn't know that at the time, but looking back on it, that's, I think, what I was doing was like trying out Paris.
Obviously, during that time, something happened that made you realize that you could and that you wanted to live here. Was there a moment?
So last summer, I was in Paris for a couple months and like kind of a rough time. It like wasn't sunshiny, romanticized, like honeymoon Paris. It was really hot. I got COVID for the first time after, dodging it for so long. And there were just like some personal things going on that it was kind of a struggle. And I realized even in the struggle that I would prefer to be here than, in other places that I call home, like New York or Seoul even, because I wanted to be here and that feeling was stronger than the pull to go home even when times were tough. And that kind of sealed the deal for me. Is like, hey, if I can be here when things are hard, then that tells me everything I need to know. So that's when I decided last summer that I was going to move to Paris.
1 year later from that, many years later than the first Fête de la Musique, how do you feel like right now? How do you feel right now living in Paris?
I'm so happy to be in Paris. I made a good decision, I think. And, we've talked about this. It's like not every day is great, and there are certainly things that are inconvenient and a little challenging. But still, despite all of that, I'll take all of that to be here, So I'm very, very happy to be in Paris.
I don't know if you've thought much about this, and maybe you have. Do you have any vision or things you're looking forward to or things you're excited about, like for your next decade living in France and living in Paris? Like, because you're here. So is it having a country house? Is it hitting every country in Europe? I mean, there's so much opportunity with that.
I think both of those things sound great. Like I would love to have a country house and hit every country in Europe and city that I want to go to. But you know what? I think I would like to build a home here. Not like physically, but like I would like to find a space that really feels like my space and make it that. Does that make sense? I'm in a great apartment right now, but I'm here for a year on a lease. And I think that I would like to find more after this, find a kind of more of just like my real nest in Paris where I can feel really good and safe and happy and cozy and all of the things. So I think that's sort of my vibe. And then maybe country house comes later. But first I'd like to find a more like a real me apartment in the city, you know?
I do feel like the amount of people that I know who have country houses is wild and aspirational. I'm into it.
I think it's an attainable goal.
I mean, I think so too. It just seems like you find a small town, find an inexpensive house. I actually don't think it's probably as easy as I'm thinking it is. So you're working partially for a French music company, at least right now, right? You're consulting?
So that's another funny thing. So when I moved to Paris, I thought I was going to take a break for like 6 months, hang out, enjoy the city, focus on French class, all of that. Well, that's not what happened because during that time, I was having all these conversations with people because a lot of people were surprised that I left YouTube because, it was a very good job. It was a fulfilling job. I was doing a lot, things that I liked. I worked with people that I loved, with artists that I loved. It was a kind of, I think a lot of people would look at it as a pretty risky move to leave a job without a job, right? But I was like, all right, I'm going to take a break and hang. During that time, I was having a lot of conversations with people about that exactly. It's like, hey, I don't want a full-time gig. Maybe I'll start to work on some creative projects in the next few months. Very open-ended. That quickly turned into people saying, oh, well, I have this project that maybe we could use you on, or that project we could use you on. And suddenly I found myself like having established a company and had clients on retainer. And it was like, what? Like within like 6 weeks of moving here. It was insane. So I didn't have the break that I anticipated. But I think the good thing is with this client work, it kind of ebbs and flows. So when it's busy, it's really busy and stressful. And like you've seen me kind of dash out of things to get on calls and whatnot. But for the most part, it's pretty chill and flexible. And it's sort of lending creative ideas to artist teams and labels, making suggestions on marketing ideas. And yeah, that's what I'm working on right now.
And you got to sort of do a full circle with an album, right?
I did. So my first client was a French client, and it was management team for Daft Punk, which was insane because 10 years ago at Columbia Records, I worked.
So cool.
I know. I worked on their last album, Random Access Memories, and it was one of the last album campaigns that I worked on at Columbia. So it was very like seared in my memory of certain things that we did and the way that the guys moved and like what their sort of values were and things like that was like very interesting and different, for me at the time. And, I was asked to come join the team to put out the 10th anniversary edition of the album and help them create some new content and a few other things. And it was so rewarding to me and so cool just that 10 years later, I was back working on this project that I really knew inside out and loved so much and was like really an important release for me. And to be able to work on it again was like, wow, what a blessing. What a privilege.
That's incredible. Well, I wanted to ask you about, so you're from Korea originally, and I wanted to pivot into like our absolute favorite subject of the world, which is food.
Yes.
Have you eaten a lot of Korean food here? Have you found good Korean spots? Have you been more like trying sort of the cuisine?
I'm actually going to a Korean restaurant tonight.
No way.
It's funny. So when I first came to Paris, there wasn't a ton of Korean food, right? There wasn't a lot of knowledge about Korea at the time. But I think, in the past 5-10 years with the effect of like BTS and just like Korean pop culture in general, TV and movies and all of that, Korea has become very trendy in Paris in a way that I didn't expect. So when I got here in February, I actually went to this like K-pop festival at Bercy, the arena. And a friend of mine was playing the festival. And so I went with him, and I couldn't believe what I was seeing, that there were 20,000 kids, 20,000 people in this arena who were singing and rapping in Korean. Like, what? And it wasn't 20,000 Korean, immigrant kids, expat kids. And no, it was like, these were like legit, very diverse French audience that was just down for the K-pop and Korean hip hop. It was wild. It was wild. But it left such an impression on me. And just like kind of going around in the city, there's so many Korean restaurants, different types of Korean restaurants, that it's really great to see. And, for me, obviously I love Korean food, and to cook Korean food, that the fact that I can get everything that I need to make Korean food is so comforting.
So like the Korean markets are good.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, totally.
That's actually a really interesting point to make that I hadn't even thought about, is like going to a city and being like, oh, I can get great Indian food here or whatever, but also being able to be like someone who can cook Indian food and being like, I can find it. I can find the right spices and I can find fresh ingredients.
Yeah, like find the stuff. Yeah, because you need the stuff, right? And the stuff is pretty accessible here, which is so wonderful and very comforting, actually.
Well, and Grace made homemade kimchi, which she's promised me some of, which I'm excited about. Yeah. Okay, so I know that this list will be long, so I'm just going to ask, what are some of your top favorite places? Again, I know there's a lot, so I guess maybe things that if someone was visiting, where you would send them, and also maybe actually separately, are there any spots where, if you're just coming through town and you've got 2 days, you don't need to do this. But if you live here, it's like, oh, this little corner place is really incredible.
Well, you and I went to a corner place recently that, again, I probably wouldn't send a visiting friend to, but Giclette, which is a wine bar in the 11th, around the corner from my apartment. It's such a cute little spot.
Go there.
Totally, I'll be there. Is a really small wine bar that has a really lovely, thoughtful menu too, of snacks, and kind of the snacks sort of have a Korean and Japanese bent to them. But the food is really good. The wine is really good. And it's just like a little neighborhood spot that, is a good hangout. But I would say sort of like one major difference in between, my life in New York and my life in Paris is that in Paris, I'm very much a creature of my neighborhood. I live in the 11th arrondissement in Paris, and I'm usually in the 11th. So my favorite spots are here. My wine bars are here. Yeah, I am a creature of the 11th. I, go to a lot of the same spots where I run into a lot of the same people, and it's like a very kind of community vibe. So let's see, some places in particular. I mean, Septime is obviously my favorite restaurant in Paris.
I think it's worth telling anyone who wants to go to Septime, try 3 weeks out is when it opens.
I think 3 weeks or 4 weeks on their site. It's a tough res, but very, very worth it. They also have Clamato next door, which is a seafood-focused restaurant. So great.
And that one's like a no reservations.
Oh, yes. Clamato is a no reservation walk-in situation. There's usually a wait, but the great thing is that they have a wine bar around the corner where you can chill and wait for your table. And the wine bar is called Septime Le Cave. Another favorite restaurant of mine in Paris, which also happens to be in the 11th, is Le Servan. I've been to Le Servan many, many, many times. And they have sort of it's a French menu with a bit of an Asian twist. It's run by two sisters who are Filipino French. And it's just every time I go there, it just like hits. It's so consistent, even when the dishes change out. The wines are incredible. It's just it's a beautiful experience. So Le Servan for sure. And then I also really love Bistro Paul Bert, also in the 11th, surprise, surprise, for a very kind of traditional bistro menu. And they have the best steak frites, like a steak with peppercorn sauce and frites in maybe ever that I've ever had. And really good desserts there too. Bistro Paul Bert.
If you're enjoying this episode of Music Around Paris, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Paris, A State of Mind, where Gail and Marie will talk all about Paris real estate and rentals. Mollie on a Trip, Music Around Paris will be right back after a word from our sponsors. Now, back to Mollie on a Trip, Music Around Paris. I would also point, I think that like when I moved here and sort of before I got here, which was, a year ago, I had heard the Marais, the Marais, the Marais. And then I kind of knew that like the first and second could be like a little fancier. But what I feel after having been here for a year is that actually, for me, the Marais isn't as cool. And the 11th is kind of the Silver Lake, the Brooklyn, like
Kind of is the Brooklyn.
the 11th is where the cool food is.
Yeah, the 11th is kind of Brooklyn-y, for sure. Vibe-wise, yeah. Vibe-wise, not distance-wise, but vibe-wise.
Yeah. I feel like the 11th really feels like it's on a pulse. It's got cool chefs. It's got cool bars. It's got cool food. And it's less touristy and it's got less it's got less chain shops. You're not seeing a Bash and a Sandro on every corner. Whereas I feel like the Marais is like, there'd almost just be like an Urban Outfitters.
Yeah. I know what you mean. I think there are obviously corners of the Marais that are great and that we like to hang out in, like Marie Celeste, for instance.
Deeply.
Or Les Enfants du Marché, for instance.
Yeah.
So Marais, fantastic, right? And from where I live in the 11th, it's very easy to walk there. So, a lot of love for the Marais, but I am a child of the 11th, for sure. And like you said, it's because it's less touristy and stuff too, that that's why I run into all the same people at the, wine bars and stuff I go to. And then, you become friends with those people and that's how things begin.
Okay. Well, I have one last question for you. So for a visitor to Paris, what would you say, this is something you need to know? Is there anything that you're this is a nugget for a traveler coming through Paris so you can have a better experience, you can understand it in a deeper way than if you didn't know this thing?
The first thing that comes to mind is that, it's funny because French people, maybe outside of France, have a reputation for being kind of snobbish or rude, but I've actually found people here are super polite for the most part. And one of the sort of clearest kind of points of evidence of that is that anytime you go into a shop, into a restaurant, into anywhere, you enter a business, you always say bonjour. You always say hello. And if you don't, it's considered rude, right? And when you leave, you always say au revoir merci. It's you greet when you enter and you greet when you leave. And it's something that definitely is not done in New York, right? Or in many places in America, I think. It's not so common in Korea as well. So seems like a very distinctly French thing that I find that when you do that and you kind of, adapt that, it feels nice. And, people are nice to you when you're saying hello when you come in and goodbye when you leave. Very basic, but it's a thing that is a thing here.
I don't know if I told this story before, but before I got my Metro Navigo card, I was using the paper tickets, which they are getting rid of, but they still have them. And actually, this is a really good tip for anyone coming to town. These little paper tickets get demagnetized very easily. Be very careful. Don't put them next to your phone.
Very easily. Credit card.
So annoying.
Yeah.
It's the worst. Because also you buy, at least we did at first, we buy packs of 10, which made sense because we were using them and they're not expensive. But then you have 10
demagnetized tickets.
Exactly. You have 10 demagnetized tickets.
Oh, that's a nightmare.
And then you have to go wait in a line in the window, which is there, 50% of the time there's someone in there. Anyway, one of these days I was going through and it was demagnetized again, for the 800th time. And this woman we definitely recognized each other because I'd had this problem so many times. And I kind of went up to her and I just sort of handed it to her and looked at her and she just looked at me. And then I was like, oh, bonjour. And she was like, bonjour. And then she changed my ticket for me and fixed it. But it was one of these really clear,
there you go.
Where we are in France, this is how you recognize my humanity and how I will then reply to you.
Yeah.
I wasn't annoyed at all. I was like, this is really poignant and humbling that this woman made this point to just stare at me until I made the nicety.
Well, but like, see, that made an impression on you. So, I'm sure now everywhere you go in and out, you're greeting people. It's a thing.
Oh my God, totally. Okay, well, Grace, really educational about you, to be honest, a lot about, the music business and stuff, but also Paris. And thank you so much for coming to chat.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored.
Thanks for being here today. Hope you enjoyed the chat on Mollie on a Trip, Music Around Paris. Please check out the other great podcasts on the Paris Underground Radio Network. If you have a second, also, please rate us on Apple Podcasts. It does actually help. And if you want to find me, I'm at Mollie on a Trip on Instagram, and I'd love to chat about music and food and wine and everything Paris. And I'm also super happy to hear suggestions for future guests. Thanks.
Mollie on a Trip, Music Around Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for the Paris Underground Radio Podcast Network.